This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development, providing graduate-level education to working professionals, online, on campus, and on-site. For more information, please visit study.stanford.edu.
I'm really excited about our speaker today, and for a long time I held the view that to be really smart, it basically was equivalent to how much math you knew, or more generally that it's a lot of specialized knowledge. And in many ways I think that's true, but as I've spent several years here, I've learned that the really smart people aren't the ones necessarily that know the most math, but the ones who just have a really enormous lucidity of thought and can see the world really clearly. And these are the things that when somebody explains them to us, we go, yes, of course it's that way. That's what I was thinking all the time, but just wasn't able to bring to my lips. And I think similarly, there's an enormous smartness, if that's a word, in questioning the tacit assumptions of the field. The ones we go, yeah, we did believe that all the time, but I never realized that. And so, over the years, Paul has been just an amazing force through his book and his related writings on demonstrating how the interactive systems that we create should respect the social and physical landscape of our worlds, in showing that technological architectures, like physical ones, nearly always make ideological commitments. And that the proximate future that we all invoke for ubiquitous computing is a way of having, blindness to the world of ubiquity that is all around us already. So with that, Paul Dourish.
Thank you. That was an especially nice introduction. Thank you. Although it does rather give me something to live up to now. All right, so it's really nice to have the chance to come. I'm spending a sabbatical year here at Stanford, but it's good to be able to come and talk to you about this work. This is a new talk, which is always a slightly dangerous thing to do, but we'll see how it works out. So for the last few years, I've been doing a lot of research sort of at the intersection of, or around two major projects. One of them is concerned with privacy, and it's particularly the relationship between privacy and identity. For several years, that was largely a technological project. We were looking at the kinds of tools we could give people to manage privacy, thinking about privacy not as something that people have, but as something that people do, that you have to act out being private, that private is performed. And most recently, that has turned into a project that sort of looks at the relationship between privacy and identity, how the ways in which we share information reflect something about who we are, or are ways that we become certain kinds of people, social actors, and so forth. The second project is one concerned with topics of mobility and spatiality. Back over 10 years ago now, I was doing some research about spatiality, thinking about how we use metaphors of space in information systems. You think about building virtual spaces. And I wanted to try to understand something about what we meant about space. And in collaboration with, I was at Xerox then, in collaboration with Steve Harrison, who was also there, who'd been trained as an architect, we tried to understand something about how architectural theorists thought about space and place. I've been going back to that work now. 10 years later, ubiquitous computing has happened, mobile phones have happened. There are some transformations in how we might think about the relationship between technology and space. And that might change how we think about or what kind of conceptual models of space we want to invoke in order to understand technological settings. The work I want to talk about today is actually arose at the intersection of these two projects. It wasn't particularly intentional that I was going to bring these two projects together, but they came together in this sort of convenient way, largely around this research on privacy, identity, and technology. Because for that research, we identified, when we wrote the grant proposal, two major sites of ethnographic investigation, broadly. One of which would be something to do with blogging, which is actually turning into a study of military blogging. And the other was going to be something to do with mobility, because we were really interested in the questions about how the places that people go and the ways in which they disclose their movements and so forth might be connected to these questions of identity. Now, this is a research project that is a collaboration between myself and two other faculty members at UC Irvine, Jenny Terry, who runs the Women's Studies program, and Simon Cole, who's in the criminology department. Both of them also have backgrounds in sort of science and technology studies, and so this has been a really interesting way for the three of us to sort of work together and work through a whole series of issues around these topics. So yeah, as I said, we had identified in our grant proposal originally these two sort of broad sites of ethnographic engagement. And while it is relatively uncommon to actually do the work that you said you were going to do in the grant proposal, we have nonetheless had these two sites. And what I want to talk about today, as I say, the blogging study has turned into a study of military bloggers, and particularly video blogging. And that's not stuff I'm going to talk about today because it's still sort of ongoing. The one I'm going to talk about today is our investigation of the mobile site. Because what we'd been thinking about at that point was, mobile phones and other sort of, wireless devices. I was thinking particularly of some of these studies. They've looked at the ways which people, manage multiple SIM cards in order to be available to different kinds of people in different kinds of ways and so forth. But the study actually turned into something slightly different. But I'm going to hold off in 1 second before I tell you what it is. The interest, though, is in some of the ways in which we talk about both location and privacy. And what I'm going to try and argue as we go through the talk is that the kinds of models we have, conceptual models we have for thinking about mobility and spatiality and for thinking about privacy are really pretty weak. And part of the reason that we have persistent problems in trying to understand how to build systems that maintain people's privacy is we just don't have the kinds of conceptual models that we need. There's a lot of interest at the moment in building technologies that attempt to answer the question, where are you? Or attempt to give people the resources to answer the question, where are you? To track people, to understand their activities and so forth. And we can read this question of where are you two ways. We could read it as a geometric matter. I am currently located at this latitude and longitude. I am currently located in the Hewlett-Packard Auditorium, in the Gates building, on the Stanford campus, and so forth. Or we could regard it as a social matter. That is, knowing how to give an answer to the question, where are you, means knowing something about the sort of social setting within which you are engaged. Yeah? When a surgeon asks another surgeon in the course of an operation, where are you, the answer is likely to be articulated with respect to the internals of a patient's body. Oh, I'm just coming up on the duodenum, right? Whatever it is, right? To be able to answer that question accurately and appropriately in context is to be able to participate in a certain kind of social life. The social life of surgeons, the social life of computer scientists, the social life of residents of the Bay Area, or whatever it is. Those are the things that give you the resources to answer those questions appropriately. So I want to try to think about this question of mobility or location and spatiality, not simply purely as geometric kinds of questions, but as ways of reflecting something about our sort of rich social life. Similarly, I'm trying to think about privacy in some of those terms too. Privacy seems to be a persistent problem. In fact, it's getting worse in the technological sort of research area. It's what I've often called it's the penultimate slide problem. You see someone give a presentation at a conference about their latest system, and the second to last slide says, of course, we've discovered that privacy is a really important problem here. And it would be very important, it's critical that we don't ignore the privacy questions. Then you move on to the next slide that says, so in conclusion, I built this cool thing and it's really cool and it runs for 3 weeks on 2 AA batteries. So I want to try and understand something about why privacy is such a persistent problem. And so what I'm going to be trying to show you is some ways that we have of sort of understanding it. So in order to do that, we wanted to work ethnographically because that's what we do. And so we wanted to find a site and a way of trying to understand some of these problems. And what we sort of lucked into was an opportunity to study a group of paroled sex offenders who are tagged with GPS units as part of their parole conditions. Now, when I put this slide up, I have to point out that neither of these people is a paroled sex offender or indeed a criminal in any way. This guy, I'm trying to check his name, this guy's name is John Lovitch. He's actually a member of the Washington State Legislature. Who is sort of, he's a sort of strong on crime kind of guy, and so for some reason he decided to wear one of these GPS units for a week. It's not quite clear what that demonstrates to really much of anybody. But the context here, of course, is an increasing interest in the ways of trying to keep track of people using via technological means. Now, the reason I was particularly interested in this study, right, is that if somebody is paroled from prison and they have as part of their parole conditions a stricture that says they must not be within 2,000 feet of a school, a playground, a public park, a swimming pool, or a library, and you want to get from A to B, right? You want to get from home to work, or you want to go to the store, and you can't come within 2,000 feet of any of those places. There's a question of just how do you do that? Yeah? You can't ask Google Maps not to help, not to move within those kinds of zones. Now, you might actually think, and we would think, I would certainly have imagined, that of course the internet would be a really useful resource for doing that. But of course, for many of these people, actually using the internet is also banned by their parole conditions for reasons that are obvious if you think about it for a minute. So the interesting thing is to ask a series of questions about what does mobility look like when mediated by technology in those ways? What does mobility look like? What does spatiality feel like when your presence in spaces is rendered technologically visible to a variety of other kinds of groups of people? Now, I'm not studying this particular population because we see them as potential users or targets for design, although there's a whole bunch of things we could say about that, and maybe we will in discussion. But rather, because, nor are we claiming that their use of these technologies is in any way typical. It is clearly very atypical. Their kind of experience of technologically enhanced surveillance, technological monitoring is clearly not the experience that we all have. But it's precisely because of that they're interesting. It's precisely because of the very particular kind of engagement they have with the technology that I think there's some reasons to look at them and some things we can learn about how mobile technologies and technologies of location are being configured that have some very strong consequences for how we want to think at a conceptual level about some of these questions. Okay, so some very quick background. I should point out, of course, that I'm not a criminologist, but some of my colleagues are, so I may get all sorts of details wrong, and I will refer you to them. The context, of course, here is sort of what has been dubbed in the legal community sort of notion of techno-corrections. The idea that advanced technologies can play a part in more effective and more cost-effective correctional activities. And although, in fact, this term has been, it was coined some time ago, and we think about the idea of, for instance, GPS units as having been, GPS monitoring of location of paroled offenders as being something that, we've been talking about for a long time. In fact, there have not been terribly many deployments of these systems in the United States to date. When we got involved in this was the people we've been involved with are part of a trial. Actually, they're part of two trials. One, a California state trial, and one, a federal trial. These technologies are not yet sort of widely deployed. And part of the trial is to determine sort of certain kinds of questions of technological feasibility, as also just how it fits into the correctional regimes. The context, the legal context, are set by things like Megan's Law and Jessica's Law, with which you may be at least passingly familiar. So Megan's Law was originally as a 1996 law, an amendation to a previous 94 Wetterling Act. The California version is 2004, and what Megan's Law does is to mandate public disclosure and availability of information about the residencies of sex offenders, so community notification kinds of things. Jessica's Law, which arose first in Florida in 2005, I think, and in California it was enacted in 2006, and increases the penalties for a variety of sexual offenses, and also mandates lifetime monitoring of parolees. Now, it's worth noting, just in passing, that both Megan's Law and Jessica's Law are, as you might take by their name, were the result of actions taken in response to particular cases of victimization. Both of them were cases of murder, not purely cases of sexual abuse, although the attention gets focused on the sexual abuse. The other thing that's important to say, just as background for some of the things I'm going to say, is that the names Megan's Law and Jessica's Law also turn our attention by and large to child sex abuse. And every time I talk to people about this work, the conversation always talks in terms of child sex abuse. But in fact, these laws apply to any kind of sexual offender. So these are not purely cases of pedophilia. Okay. Our subjects were participants in these two trials, as I said. We just sort of did a focus group study, engaged with an existing series of trials that were already going on. We worked with 10 people, 9 of whom were participants in California state trial, one of whom was part of a federal trial of technology. I may talk a little about some of the differences because they use different technologies and it was actually relevant. But you know, so these were focus groups, so it wasn't really the kind of ethnographic engagement we might really have wanted. What I want to do is just run you through. I'm going to talk first about a series of themes that emerged out of our focus group work around these questions of sort of privacy and technology and location that were fairly specific, fairly narrowed on the kinds of things that they were talking about. Then I want to take a step back and talk about a couple of larger themes that I think we can learn, or we can extract from these engagements that have relevance for mobile technologies more generally. And I'll sort of end at sort of more in terms of the kind of conceptual material. Okay, I have 5-ish of these themes. I can't quite remember because I was just editing my slides up until moments ago. And so if I seem surprised at what slide comes up on the screen, it's because I am. But I want to talk first about protection. Protection is a theme that comes up a lot, and it's what we might obviously expect. These are technologies which are being deployed in order to protect the public, in order to protect the community, in order to protect particularly children in our community, and so forth. And that's the primary focus of the entire Jessica's Law effort, is protection of potentially at-risk populations. And indeed, the people in our study talked about protection in a variety of ways, and they talked about its importance. So they sort of recognized some of those considerations, although they have a certain cynicism about whether or not being able to be within 2,000 feet of a school, public park, playground, library, swimming pool is truly protective. But nonetheless, that question of protection is what we might imagine, as being central. What I think was interesting, or what struck us as interesting when we did the study, though, was that the theme of protection extended beyond that purely of protecting the vulnerable populations. There were 2 other sorts of protection that turned out to be significant. One was protection of the parolee themselves. So a number of these people were familiar with the ways in which they would be hassled by the police once paroled from prison. Or by other members of the public, and in fact, the very fact that they were wearing the GPS unit and that their location was being reported and logged, reported to their parole officer and logged, served essentially as a permanent alibi, right? You couldn't be picked up for something you didn't do, for being in a place that you weren't, if the technology was reporting to your parole officer that you weren't there. And in fact, many of them found that very comforting. They found it comforting, too, that the device would act as a curb on their behavior because they would know that they were being monitored. But particularly, their relationships to authority and the institutions were changed by the fact that they had this device. The very fact of their accountability to their parole officer and to the police changed the nature of that kind of interaction, sometimes in their benefit, as much as in the benefit of the authorities. The other way in which the issue of protection arose that we hadn't anticipated going in was how important it became to them to protect the device itself. So the devices worn around the ankle are generally pretty fragile. In the federal trial, also the bracelet, the strap that holds it to your ankle is pretty fragile. If the device is to get broken or the strap is to get broken, either of those is a technical parole violation that could land you back in prison. And so you have to work reasonably hard to make sure that nothing bad happens. One guy had been through like 4 straps in 3 months. Obviously had not landed back in prison, but they would have to take some particular pains to protect the device. Since a lot of these guys worked construction jobs, they didn't necessarily work in places that were conducive to that, because if the device is pretty fragile, can bang into things, that's bad. The other way that protecting the device comes up is the devices can't get wet. So you can't take a bath, for instance. You can't go swimming. It was sort of ironic this trial was being done in San Diego, because like water sports were completely out. But it was a continual source of attention in the course of their daily lives to how the device was going to be protected, how many pairs of socks or medical bandages they should wear in order to cushion it from potential harm, and how it is you would have to conduct your life in order to make sure that it wasn't going to come to harm. Right? Very careful crossing your legs under a table. You might bang your ankle into the table leg, and again, a technical parole violation. Hello. I would like to move on to my next slide, please. Thank you. So protection in a variety of ways was the first of the sort of themes that came out of our engagement. A second one was questions of identity. Identity sort of manifested itself in a variety of ways. One was that just wearing the device was a continual reminder to these people about what they had done, and in itself then a reminder to themselves not to engage in that activity again. They didn't want to. And just feeling it on their ankle was something that they would sort of continually remind them of what they'd been through, what others had been through, and of the sort of limits that they wanted to introduce on their activity. Of course, the device also sort of marks you out to other people. And they all talked about various incidents where other people, friends, colleagues, people in the street, people for whom they were working, and so forth, had seen the device. That it was, and in fact, a number of them were concerned that they could get beaten up in various places if people saw the device and figured out what it was and why it was they were wearing it. Another way that sort of issues of identity came up is that they were very conscious of the sort of gradations of risk and gradations of participation. So in some states, California is not one of them, it used to be, but we changed this. Some states distinguish between various degrees of risk associated with sex offense, right? There's medium, high, low risk sex offenders. Maryland, I think, has 4 different levels. These technologies are by and large mandated for high-risk sex offenders. In California, there's only one class, and so it applies to everybody. And so they were very conscious of the fact that if they were in other states, then they would not be subject to the same kinds of surveillance regimes. So the very presence of the technology marked them as being members of a group that they didn't necessarily think they belonged to. Yeah? Carrying this device was something that denoted a degree of risk associated with them that they didn't necessarily think was appropriate. Okay. Now, space obviously is part of the focus here, right? The device is meant to prevent people from entering certain kinds of spaces, exclude them from certain kinds of zones. And so naturally, one of the things we expected, and indeed one of the things we found, was that the device sort of restructured their experience of space. But it didn't necessarily take the form that we expected. So again, 2,000-foot exclusion zone around certain kinds of areas. It isn't actually the same for every parolee. The parole conditions are different for different people. Some people have certain kinds of restrictions, others don't. And actually, it's organized by time as well as by space. But nonetheless, you have this notion of these sort of prohibited spaces. Pragmatically, however, as I said, it's pretty difficult for you to plot a route from A to B that doesn't come into proximity with one of these spaces. And while the internet might be a resource for you to help do that, again, many people are also by their parole conditions not allowed to be online. So it just meant travel just became difficult. And what the result was that most people didn't go anywhere. More interestingly, though, what it caused was a change in the scale at which these prohibitions would happen. What we found the parolees very attentive to was sort of larger scale issues about prohibition. So where were safe places to go? The safe places for them to go were not outside of a 2,000-foot zone, exclusion zone around a school, but rather a place with no schools, right? Or a place with no library. And they would talk about their region, about Southern California in general, in terms of this sort of geography of danger to them, associated with the density of these sort of these potential exclusion zones. Yeah. So where they would go for a weekend away, where they would go. To relax would generally be to a place where there was no danger of them potentially violating one of these exclusions. It's not a sort of, plotting your route in a way that sort of skirts around danger zones, but rather an escape from a dangerous area altogether to one less fraught. So these spaces of safety and danger played out at a different kind of scale than we expected. Sort of odd in some ways, when you think about technology that's organized, it's like designed to be, coming down to the level of a meter or a yard or a foot, but in fact gets handled in terms of the ways in which it creates structures of much greater size. And then the other question, of course, when you're trying to think about the structuring of space is structured according to whom? Structured by whom and by what means? So one person reported to us a problem, for instance, where he'd gone somewhere on the weekend that he had thought was like 28 miles away. According to the odometer of his car, it was 28 miles away. But according to his parole officer, and in particular according to the MapQuest data, he said MapQuest, I wasn't sure if it was MapQuest, but nonetheless, they all talked about MapQuest. According to MapQuest, it was 32 miles away. And this person had a 30-mile limit on travel. And so he got into trouble for being 32 miles away. And there's this interesting little moment at which there has to be a negotiation about essentially who has ground truth about the distance traveled. Yeah? Different technologies are at work here when you're having to navigate according to different kinds of technologies that will help you understand where you might be, different kinds of ways of inscribing a mathematical reality onto the space, and they're in competition. And now obviously because of the sort of parole conditions and so forth, here MapQuest wins. MapQuest will always win by definition because it's the parole officer who's responsible for monitoring. Although MapQuest, again, not necessarily available to the people who are being monitored, they are trying to match that against what technologies are available to them, such as the odometer in a car. And so the structure of space is particularly interesting because there are multiple structures, arguably, that are sort of intersecting, coinciding, and the question is how do we move between different kinds of structures that are different kinds of mathematical structures and descriptive structures that are sort of operational at the same time. So space, as I say, was one that we had sort of expected. We'd gone into this in order to try to understand something about those questions of the structuring of space. The structuring of time turned out equally, though, to be really important. Some things were simply about restrictions that were on people at different times of day. If you're not meant to be around kids, then when schools get out is a difficult time of day for you. You have to make sure you're not in the wrong place. But the really interesting one that was actually more technological is just the problem of charge. So I said that we had people in two trials, a state trial and a federal trial. They had slightly different technologies. The people in the state trial were all jealous of the people in the federal trial because they had better devices. They had more recent devices. They were smaller, but in particular, they held charge for longer. The GPS units being worn by the people in the state trial held charge for 6 to 8 hours. The devices being held by people in the federal trial held charge for 8 to 10 hours. If your device runs out of charge, it's a technical parole violation. Because your location is no longer being reported, you're not being tracked. So in exactly the same way as it's a parole violation for you to break the device or tamper with it or for it to become damaged, it's a parole violation for it to run out of charge. So charge is a continual orientation that these people have. Now there isn't an indicator on the device of how much charge it has. It just beeps and a light flashes when it's running out of charge, and at that point you have 20 to 30 minutes to charge it up again. And this would become a problem for them when they started to try to think about, well, working a job, right? You're trying to hold down a job, especially, for instance, like again, for many of them working construction, and especially when you factor in travel time, there's just that question about how do you have to organize your day so that you are near to charge. Yeah. One person actually speculated about what you would do if you were homeless, which is a kind of interesting question. People would complain about not being able to go camping and things like that because they'd be too far away from charge. But in particular, the structuring of the day turned out to be a major kind of issue for people because they had to orient their day around the ability to be able to charge the device. It turns out, it wasn't on the slides because I hadn't noticed it at first until we went back. It turns out actually the problem of overcharging the devices as much of a problem as undercharging. There's no voltage regulator or anything in it. So if it gets it's got to be charged for so long and not for any longer. And so even what some of them would try to do, which is just to plug it in overnight, which was difficult because the cable wasn't very long, so you'd have to move your bed, didn't work terribly well. So you'd actually have to be up and awake and sort of conscious of while you were charging it. Yeah.
Many GPS devices don't work well indoors, like say in this room.
Yeah, so I believe, let's see. I'm going to give you two answers, right? The first and important contextualizing one is we were actually just talking to the parolees. Parolees don't actually have a really good idea about how the device works. They have all sorts of folk theories about how the device works, but I'm not actually terribly sure. I believe that what happens is that for certain places where they might be a lot of the time, in particular home, there's another unit. There's something else that sort of it basically is sort of taking over once they're inside the home. I believe that's sort of reading between the lines from some things that people said. But they weren't able to articulate to us these kinds of questions. They aren't given very much training on these things. There's a spiel they're given by their parole officer to tell them the things to do and not to do. They are actually trained on how to cross their legs underneath a table without banging their ankle into the table leg. But it's very light on technical details as far as I can tell. We actually got a copy somewhere of the one sheet that are given. It was not sufficient for any of them to be able to articulate exactly those kinds of questions. Yeah, the places where we know that GPS doesn't work, indoors, Manhattan, whatever. Oh, I thought I'd lost the microphone. So issues of, for instance, long distance travel was another issue they would bring up. A guy who had family back east, but if he was on the plane that long, it would be he'd be away from charge. So overcharging as much of a problem as undercharging, and that charge issue sort of means that what they have to orient towards is the way in which, through the kind of technological mediation that we have in place here, there's not only a structuring of space, but also a structuring of time. And then the last of these sort of detail themes I want to talk about is this question just of sort of disciplining the body. Again, not something we did sort of anticipated going in, but something towards which people were continually oriented. And I've sort of brought up a couple of these as I've been talking about it, right? Which is that the device needs to be let me say something I was going to say later, but maybe I'll say it twice. Always good to say things multiple times. Here's an interesting irony, right, that I think helps us understand something about this issue of the disciplining of the body. We're talking in terms of mobile technologies, because our interest is in technologies of mobility and technologies of location. In some sense, the GPS units we're talking about here are ultimately mobile devices. They go everywhere the person does. In another sense, they are highly immobile, right? They're fixed to the ankle and they don't move off the ankle. maybe up and down a little bit, but not very much otherwise. And so one is continually oriented towards the ways in which one is wearing the technology. Its very being worn and its permanence there is significant. Yeah? It's significant in terms of, for instance, how you comport yourself, how you walk around, that you don't get too close to large bodies of water in case you get splashed, that you don't submerge yourself in bodies of water, that you are careful when you cross your legs underneath the table, etc., etc. So movement, bodily deportment is important. It comes up also in how you clothe yourself. A thing that a number of people pointed out was that, okay, so they're in San Diego. It's warm in San Diego, by and large. If you want to go exercising, if you want to go running, then you're going to get pretty hot, but you can't wear shorts because you've got this device that you don't want to expose to anybody, and so it's just too hot to exercise in long pants in the summer. One guy who used to run half marathons and things like that was sort of pointing that out. Somebody else said the two main things he wanted when the device was going to be taken off him was to be able to take a bath and to be able to wear shorts. So in fact, it's just interesting that even the way in which your body moves through space and the way you clothe your body has some kinds of interaction with the technologies that we're talking about here. I already mentioned this sort of issue of sleeping. What does that say, wearing and sleeping, I wonder? The sort of, right, again, being careful not to bang the device when you turn over in the middle of the night. The person who tried to charge it up overnight and had to sort of reorganize his sleeping arrangements in order to do that. But there's a variety of ways in which when we think about mobile technologies, I think we need to be attentive to just the very issues of where they get worn and how they get worn and what the consequences of that might be for one's availability, participation in different kinds of groups and so forth. And I'll have more to say about that in a second. Why is it doing this? Okay. So, I want now to take a step back. I've been talking about some fairly specific things that were encountered by a very specific set of people. And again, I said at the beginning, we didn't go to study paroled sex offenders because we were targeting them as a potential user population. We didn't go and study paroled sex offenders particularly because of any kind of political motivation. And really, this is not a talk about paroled sex offenders. And to talk about mobility, and the reason we went to look at these people was because they have a very particular series of orientations towards the ways in which technology, privacy, and mobility are conjoined, and the ways in which they interact. And that if we see that there may be some value for us, we believed, in trying to get outside of that zone that we're normally in, where we're thinking about what's a cool application I can put on someone's cell phone that will help them find where their friends are and what bar they should go and hang out in tonight and when the next train is coming. Can we look at a different population in order to try to reconceptualize some of those questions? And so that's sort of why we wanted to sort of look at this, where it's based on the assumption that there's going to be more and more of these kinds of technologies, and you can see, even if you just look at the trajectory within the research literature, that topics of mobility, location-based systems, and so forth are increasingly of research interest to computer scientists and technology designers. So we want to try to be able to take a step back and talk in a little more detail about the kinds of social contexts within which those technologies get deployed, what kinds of social and cultural work they are doing, what other kinds of things are involved in that, to sort of so we're looking at these people in order to sort of reframe some of those questions for ourselves. So what I want to do now then, having gone through some of this sort of detailed stuff, is try to lift it up a level and talk a little more not abstractly, but rather try to say what kinds of things can we take out of that might help us understand how to deal with other kinds of mobile technologies, ones that we might use ourselves, and ones that we might develop for others. And there's sort of three sort of big themes I want to that I think are really relevant in here. And the first is the issue of legibility of space. One of the things that is, let's see, how am I going to do this? Okay. Location-based systems all talk and operate in terms of some kind of spatial frame, some kind of spatial logic. Yeah? We have an understanding of space around which we develop our system. Maybe the GPS system gives us latitude and longitude, whatever it is, any kind of technology. A variety of people have looked at the ways in which you could start to use, crowdsourcing techniques to identify what a particular place is, what by this sort of how many people call it different kinds of things. It's like, okay, if I have enough reports that this is Safeway, then it must be Safeway. Spatial logics of that sort, things that distinguish one place from another, things that describe, that connect places together or separate them, are sort of at the heart of a lot of these kinds of location-based systems. One of the things that this study, I think, turns our attention towards is the fact that those spatial organizations, those spatial logics are not pre-given. They are consequences of the ways in which people move around. They are outcomes of movement rather than being sort of pre-given. The fact that certain kinds of places are safe from the perspective of the parolees in terms of how subject to hassle, how much hassle they might be subject to there, how many obstacles are there for them to avoid, the rest of it, is a consequence of their sort of moving around in space. It's an outcome. Yeah, it's not, can't be pre-structured. And indeed, the negotiations they go through with their parole officers are about the development of spatial logics, not about the enforcement of spatial logics. And a lot of this turns around questions of legibility. And we sort of distinguish here between two kinds of legibility. And when I say legibility, I'm sort of talking about the way in which the technology makes the space legible, allows us to read it as having certain kinds of properties, as being available to people or unavailable, as being safe or dangerous, as having a certain kind of structure to it, and so forth. Yeah? So two kinds of legibility: legibility from within and legibility from without. And by the legibility from within, I'm referring to the way in which the space is sort of inhabited and lived. What kind of structure does space take on through the ways in which we inhabit it? Yeah? All of you have a particular kind of, if I asked you to draw a map of your daily life, you would be able to draw a map that involves things like home, your favorite bar, a couple of restaurants, where you go to work, campus, the bus route you take, perhaps, the trains that you take, where they run, where your friends' houses are, and so forth, places you commonly go, the supermarkets, and so on. Yeah? There's some kind of order to that space that's really very particular to you. It's particular to your habits, where you move, when you move, how you get there, what kinds of times you're going, under what kinds of constraints, and so forth. Similarly, for the people we were talking to, there was a way in which the space took on certain kinds of structure in terms of zones of exclusion or safety, places they could be, the ways in which they were tied to them at particular kinds of times, the availability of particular kinds of infrastructures, such as power, and so forth. Yeah? As it's inhabited, the space takes on a certain kind of structure. That structure, I'd argue, is actually far more pertinent to these people than any geometric account of the space, any kind of map. It's a lived space as opposed to a represented space. It's the result of spatial practice. We want to focus on the practice. And what's interesting here is that the technology in question, in this case the GPS technology, but I think this is true of any mobile technology, provides a new kind of way of encountering and creating that kind of legibility in space. The space becomes legible in terms of what the technology can do, what the technology can tell me about the space, and also what it can tell others about me in space. So I think I want to try and think about a lot of mobile technologies in terms not simply of what they can tell me about what's around me, but how they render my world, my space, legible. How they distinguish between positions, routes, and so forth, and how they collapse them. This is all sort of aspects of legibility. There's a famous study done back in the mid-1960s, I think, but it might have been late 1950s, by Kevin Lynch, who's an urban theorist, where you would have people draw maps of the cities they lived in. And the interesting thing about the maps they would draw is that by and large they didn't have any kind of correspondence to the actual layout of the cities. But what they were drawing you essentially was maps of what they did. And the zones of the city were very much drawn from the perspective of people who engaged in certain kinds of actions. So it's not just that there's more detail or more accuracy here where I live and less over there, but also that the city gets organized as, well, this is where we go shopping and this is where we go out to restaurants, and over here is the park and things like that, right? An orientation towards these things in those kinds of ways. I think one of the things we're going to increasingly see with a variety of mobile technologies is the ways in which they render spaces legible in those ways. Yeah? And that's sort of the legibility from within. The question of the legibility from without is the way in which my activities become visible to other people who aren't necessarily in the space with me. For our guys, that was the fight about whose account of how far Hamul is from San Diego arose between them and the parole officer. Yeah? Is my odometer on the car correct? Is MapQuest correct? Does it take account of the routes I follow and so forth? How am I being rendered legible to others in terms of my presence in the space? How does any mobile technology broadcast our availability, broadcast our location to others, or show others where we might be, and what does it mean for me to be able to comport myself so that I'm in control or at least cognizant of the ways in which I'm appearing to other people? Yeah? How does the legibility of my space appear when viewed from outside of the frame of its actual performance? So some of that is about representational schemes. Some of that is about the MapQuest data. And representational schemes are, there's a whole other a series of talks to be given about representational schemes in space, right? You think of all the battles over maps and projections, and Mercator's projection and what it does to the southern hemisphere and the land masses of the southern hemisphere. Think about debates between Aboriginal Australians and the Western settlers in Australia about what land title might even be and what it means to be able to demark boundaries. Similarly, fights between the U.S. government and Native American peoples about how it is that traditional cultural properties are to be demarked. Representation, these things are all about representations, and representations are very powerful political and contested things. So whenever we start to talk about legibility, you're talking about the potential for battles, debates, and struggles about the legitimacy of different kinds of representations. I think as we just start to try to even get an understanding of, for instance, where GPS works and where it doesn't, and what it means to be in one of those places, and as we increasingly deploy technologies that make people potentially available to each other, and therefore create. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll say that on the next slide. But I'll do this one first. So the second of these sort of broader themes is this one about technology and the body that I think has been largely neglected when we think about mobile technologies, partly because we're sort of in a prototypical stage with many of them, and so they don't necessarily have the form that we would expect them to have when finally deployed. But nonetheless, if we think about technologies to be carried, technologies to be worn, we're automatically invoking a series of considerations about the configuration of a technology towards the body. Right? So we saw this thing where this mobile technology, the GPS unit, was firmly immobile with respect to the body. It was stuck on the ankle. It couldn't be moved to the waist or the arm as appropriate. And it had to be visible to certain kinds of people at certain kinds of times. We could think also about how other kinds of technologies imply certain kinds of configurations of device to body, right? If my cell phone has a vibrate mode that I use a great deal of the time, then probably I need to keep it very close to me. I need to be able to feel that. It's something for me, so it automatically is about, the choices I make about how I'm going to be signaled are choices I'm also making about how I wear the technology in its position with respect to me. people in Japan often go and take their cell phones to be blessed because they're thinking about things that are going to be worn next to the body, and anything you wear next to the body is something that you would want to have some kind of protection for, yeah, to protect you from as well. And never mind all the speculation just now about the dangers of RF signals and devices held close to the head and so forth. So there's just a whole series, I think, of things about mobile and portable technologies that we're not thinking about and talking about that are to do with how these things are going to be worn and how they're going to be configured with respect to the body, and how it is my body and my bodily movements then have to be configured. Yeah. If the technology is only going to work when in certain kinds of spaces, then am I going to plan my route home to make sure that I stay in those spaces so that I can be visible to others in the ways in which I might want to be? Yeah? And especially then when you start to have these thick technologies deployed in situations where there's more sort of contests over power, such as with children. So there's a whole series of questions, I think, that we can start to ask about the ways in which we think about these technologies as being bodily technologies, things that both are configured with respect to and therefore have implications for the body, its comportment and deportment. Okay, and then the third of these, which is really sort of the biggie and the one that I'm trying to push on most, is to do with privacy and how we conceptualize privacy, but in particular trying to think about it outside of the sort of the model that we traditionally invoke. How I'm doing for time, great. So as I said at the beginning, I think I've sort of talked, as we've gone through, I've perhaps given you a sense of how it is that I'm arguing that we don't really have a very good, that the conceptualization we have of space as something that's, Cartesian and abstract is not a particularly productive and useful way of thinking about it. But even more so, I'm concerned that the kinds of ways we have of conceptualizing privacy when we talk about information technology settings are pretty weak. In particular, what privacy often comes down to is this sort of account of economic rationality. I'll tell you something in exchange for some benefit. Was I just talking about vibrate mode? Thank you. So this notion that, well, I will disclose my location in exchange for the value of the services that you can give me, and the more valuable the services you give me, the more often I might be able to disclose my location, or the more often, or the more detail I'll give you about where I am and the rest of it. There's sort of a trade-off in that, right? It's a sort of model of economic rationality. I'll give you so much money, you'll give me something. Yeah? Sort of individual decisions made by rational actors. And I've been arguing for some time that that's not really a very good way to think about privacy, and in particular not a good way to think about the exchange of information. When I get home at the end of the day and my wife says, well, what happened today? And I tell her things that happened in my day, I'm not exchanging that information for some kind of benefit. Oh, she'll love me more if I tell her more information about what happened. In fact, if I tell her more about what happened, she'll love me considerably less, I suspect. So I just don't think that economic account of what's going on is sufficient for accounting for what's happening. And I think something is very true in this situation too. It's clear for the parolees that they're not. There isn't a question of voluntarily giving out their information in order to gain some kind of benefit. That's not what's going on. But even more than that, I want to try and start to think about location-based technologies in terms of accountability. One's accountabilities, actually, to various social groups, the accountabilities of being in certain kinds of places at certain kinds of times. Yeah? That is, that what it means to have a day when you're spent, to be in the office or to be out of the office, to be in a bar or not to be in a bar, to be at home, to be out. These are all sort of. I'm accountable to different sets of people in different ways for my presence and absence in certain kinds of places. People who know me well, I might be more accountable to. My members of my family, I might be more accountable to for where I am, whereas I don't really have to account for anybody for where I am right now, except, of course, that I'm on sabbatical, and I did have to account for that to my university and so forth. the different kinds of participation I have in different places render me accountable to different sets of different groups. For these guys, for the sex offenders, the sort of primary sources of accountability are the parole officer, the police and other authorities, other sex offenders, because they sort of operate on this sort of buddy system with respect to a sort of rehabilitative regime, so they're accountable to each other. And the public at large, lawmakers and so forth. These accountabilities may be as much about absence as they are about presence. It's not simply where you are, it's that you are also not where you're not meant to be. The one might be accountable for being somewhere, but one might be accountable also for not being there, for a failure to be in a particular kind of place. And that these kinds of accountabilities are productive of space rather than responsive, right? The organization of the space, the spatial logics, is a consequence of, is a production of the kinds of accountabilities that I have, the kinds of ways that those accountabilities reflect my participation in different kinds of social groups, my membership, my identity, and so forth. So there's a series of sort of intertwined issues here between enacted practices of space rather than sort of spatial representations as coming first and practice second. Enacted practices of privacy, that is, privacy is something that people do rather than something that people have, and the technology and how the technology allows for certain kinds of practice to result. Sorry, I'm reading my notes, which I only just added like just before I got into the room. We have this way often when we talk about socio-technical systems, when we talk about the relationship between the social and the technical, to think about the social as something that's consequent to design or an engagement with technology. That I build something, I put it out there, or I give it to somebody, and they use it, and social stuff will happen afterwards, out of what they do. They'll use it to, a community will develop, a way of using the technology will develop. They will engage in social relationships through the cell phone or whatever it is, through the device that I've given them. I want to try and think instead about the ways in which the kinds of representations we use, the kinds of ideas we have about dealing and interacting with systems, the kinds of representations that we build into those systems, representations of people, representations of actions and so forth, are sort of the outcomes of engaged social action rather than necessarily its their antecedents. We're already, when we build these technologies, building in the consequences of our own kinds of assumptions about what those social arrangements might be. And if we do that in a way that forces out what it is that people are going to do when they pick up the technology, and how it is they're going to use it to sort of as a platform to enact social reality. Then we're going to then we have a sort of a variety of problems and mismatches will occur. One of the things that we're seeing when we look at the GPS study is the way in which the spatial logics that people are bringing to bear, the spaces that they are enacting themselves, are much more relevant to sort of sites of interaction than geometric accounts of space. We're seeing a model of privacy that operates not in terms of an economic rationality per se, but rather in terms of degrees and forms of participation in different kinds of social groups as reflected in the accountabilities that people have. And I think that's a sort of different perspective for trying to go in and design new kinds of location technologies, and even just to conceptualize of location and privacy in the sort of accounts of those technologies. So in summary then, I just want to point to a couple of things. I mean, one, just because I've found in previous talks that I need to sort of underscore this, is sort of the methodological consideration, again, that we deliberately set out to investigate the experience of a set of people whose position is really quite extreme with respect to the technology and certainly quite unusual. It's not, again, that we regard these as as users for prototypes, nor even that I'm not even arguing, and we'll all become more and more like parole sex offenders monitored with GPS technologies. This is not sort of like a surveillance state kind of argument. But I do want to use them in order to point out the sort of relationship between a technological reality and a social and cultural reality. And if we can try to understand something of that relationship, I think there are some lessons for how we want to sort of think about the technologies that we might be developing. In particular, trying to do that by, to some extent, reconceptualizing and perhaps reframing how we think about issues of privacy. And move from privacy to accountabilities. Think about location, and essentially a move from geometric and Cartesian account of location to a sort of social account of spatiality. And presence. Presence as perhaps one of the elements of a form of social engagement, that my presence is something through which I perform identity and social relations as much as it is simply a coincidence of me and a set of coordinates. Okay, and I hope we have some time for questions. Yeah.
May I know what kind of next steps you're taking with this study?
I only just got done with the paper. Well, let's see. So this feeds in, as I said, this sort of feeds into a broader series of projects that we're doing around questions of spatiality and location-based technologies. And in particular, what a number of my students are looking at those questions with respect to different kinds of urban spaces. So we're trying to see, okay, if we have this picture of of sort of the production of spatiality as opposed to its pre-givenness, what does that mean for the ways in which we build technologies that help people, move around in urban spaces? So one thing that we're doing is a series of ethnographic engagements in different kinds of urban spaces. I was actually just talking to some people about this at lunch earlier. And those will lead to design engagements, but it's hard to say yet what those are going to be because it will come out of the specificities of those kinds of ethnographic engagements. But what we carry forward from this work is this idea of trying to find alternative, or trying to work with alternative accounts of spatiality. For me, and I didn't put much of it into this talk, for me what that has meant is going and reading a lot of stuff in cultural geography. It's really, I work in ubiquitous computing. I think ubiquitous computing technologies are fundamentally spatial, and it surprises me in some ways that there's so little turn to those places where we might find conceptual models about space and spatiality, and a lot of that is in social and cultural geography at the moment. But there's very little of that work that gets reflected in the technology side. So the question is, how can we think about technologies that help people perform and enact different kinds of spatialities? So that's sort of in a very, very broad sense where it's going, but I don't have, a prototype technology to show you because that's sort of, that's one stage ahead of where we are just now.
Yeah, so I guess thinking about the surveillance based on GPS and that kind of like constant anyone, at least a set of anyone who could be watching me, but they're probably not watching me right now, is evocative of like Foucault's panopticon. But I guess I was sort of interested in how, in some ways, your emphasis of on the body and the fact that the body is marked in this way is actually kind of evokes the earlier phase that Foucault talks about, in which the power of the sovereign is inscribed on the body of the offender in a kind of like public display. And so the ways in which maybe as the ideas of the panopticon move out of a fixed place into the surround with us as mobile technology, it actually is a move back to this inscribing of the power of the sovereign on the body of the condemned.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd agree. So let's see, a couple of things. I mean, one thing is that given that we're dealing with situations of sort of correctional institutions here, I'd actually claim this is much closer to Bentham's panopticon than Foucault's, right? I mean, that's exactly where Foucault took the concept of the panopticon. But it's very, I mean, yes, this is panopticon almost as architecture in that kind of sense. Again, I want to be careful about the ways in which we try to generalize from this particular example, and you could argue, I think, that yes, perhaps that sort of that earlier sort of mark of sovereign power is characteristic of something of what's happening with the sex offenders, right? I mean, and they talk about the scarlet letter. I had it on my slide, but that's a phrase that at least one of them used. What I do think, I'm thinking about how we can learn from this for the technologies that other populations are going to make use of, that we all may use, that we may all be using already. And the reason then I wanted to turn to this question of accountabilities is a question of how it is that those technologies will mediate our accountabilities to each other. And I think in that sense, perhaps we get more to that sort of more dispersed kind of power, or sort of the biopower kind of arguments in Foucault, that it's actually about a way in which we all collectively consent to certain kinds of accountability mediated by the representations these technologies can offer us. So yeah, it's possible there's more of that sort of sovereign power argument with respect to the GP, with respect to these guys. I think the interesting question is what happens as we sort of follow it through to other places, because in some sense, and I mean, I don't think that the sort of state surveillance model is the thing that I want to sort of argue is going to be sort of carried forward from here. That's a particularity of that situation that, and I want to sort of try and think about how it is the same kind of factors play out more with respect to each other, to our sort of much more generalized kind of audience. So there, perhaps a question of sort of the way we all sort of mutually consent to be accountable to each other is relevant. Certainly, a sort of Foucauldian docile bodies argument is relevant with respect to how it is we all learn to and adapt to the carrying of these devices and making them available to the infrastructures. Right, I have to reposition myself with respect to the monitoring infrastructure, and I have to consent to do that, and even perhaps just automatically take it as being my normal and natural duty. It becomes naturalized in those ways. So that, I mean, that's, I guess, how I would articulate that with respect to those kinds of Foucauldian arguments. Yeah.
You have this economic model of cost-benefit analysis for privacy that seems absolutely dominant in my experience as well. Where does that come? Why is that so trenchant, and what can be done to change it? You have kind of this notion of accountabilities, but I'm not sure if you could talk maybe more about history and changing paradigms.
Yeah, it's an interesting question to ask where it comes from. I don't really know where it comes from. I've reflected occasionally that there are two forms of social science that are acceptable to computer scientists. One is neoclassical economics, and the other is social networking theory, because both of them look like things we already know how to do. Right? One of them looks like parallel communicating systems, and the other one looks like networks. And so that there might be some kind of just basic alignment between conceptual models that allows people to pick that up. I think also is a question of just it's one of these places where, and this is what I've been arguing for privacy for a while, where our language lets us down. The language that we have is the language of exchange, because as soon as you commoditize the notion of information, as opposed to thinking about what kinds of things under what circumstances an act becomes informative. If you think about it as information, you've automatically invoked this exchange model, right? And that goes to 1950s cybernetics. So you go read like Kathy Hales or that sort of stuff. It goes to Reddy's notion of the conduit metaphor, which is a really useful device. What can be done to undo it? It's a very good question too, and I'm not sure I have terribly good answers because I've been trying for a couple of years and I'm not sure I've succeeded terribly well. So clearly the answer is don't publish in the places I've been publishing. I mean, I think one of the things we are trying to do through a series of studies is to try to emphasize the ways in which orientation towards information is in fact a way that social life is lived, right? Or as opposed to thinking about it in terms of exchange. And that also gets you away from sort of rational actor models in which everybody is making an independent decision and somehow the collective outcome is simply a result of all those kinds of individual decisions, because that's not sort of what's at work there. So my strategy is usually one of like continuing to beat everybody with a culture stick, but I'm not sure that's actually tremendously effective in displacing those kinds of models. I think perhaps the strategy, one other strategy is not so much to attempt to displace the models as much as to highlight their limits. Right? They clearly work up to a certain point. They work for certain kinds of for certain kinds of settings. There are ways in which people most certainly engage in those kinds of deliberations within certain kinds of bounds. It's like, okay, it can tell me something about store loyalty cards, but it's not telling me very much about these sort of broader patterns of interactions amongst intimates and so forth.
Yeah, I'm wondering how much the notion of safe and dangerous locations and the structuring of space in general is created by the technology or more as a function of the restrictions put on these people. And I'm wondering if you talked to any other parolees who weren't in the technology study to sort of see how their mental model of space correlated to this.
It'd be interesting. We didn't. And for a couple of reasons. One, because one, we just didn't. But also it was part of the structure of the study and the way we got in and the kind of access we got was that we were sort of, we were adding ourselves to an existing study that was very much of the technology, and so the ways in which people were sort of consented in was part of that, although consent is a sort of an odd word to use under the circumstances. My initial inclination is to say that it's probably a mistake to try to separate the spatiality of their conditions from the elements of their conditions from the elements of the technology, because they're fundamentally interwoven, right? It would not be possible to have those kinds of restrictions outside of the presence of those kinds of technologies. Not to nearly their degree of specificity. And indeed, the very kinds of violations that one can therefore be accused of are consequences of the kinds of violations we can detect. And so the technology is already implicated in the parole conditions. The parole conditions are organized around the technology, and I suspect that we should really try to see those as a complex rather than separating them. So I will certainly take your point as arguing that I need to be perhaps a little more careful when I talk about some of this stuff, not to fall into the trap of seeming to attribute these to one or the other, because I think what we're talking about is sort of a system of technology-enabled, surveillance and regulation that depends fundamentally on both of those properties.
Well, yeah. I think he has a good point that it may well be useful to look at people who don't necessarily have the technology as a sort of control group thing. I believe the law one of these restrictive laws went into effect this week. It was on NPR. They said the switch has been turned. And is this technology widely fielded yet? No. I think the answer is no. Right. So there's all these people that this law is applied to now, like suddenly, and there's no way to, specifically track them, right?
I mean, we were doing our stuff.
And one other point is that parolees have had restrictions on their movements for a long time, just in general, and other people have also. So it might well be as a way to generalize the thinking, to look at other populations too.
Yeah, so I absolutely take the point, from both of you that it would be really useful, I think, to look at people under similar kinds of strictures, but not with the same kinds of technology. Although I believe that the detail of the kind of parole conditions that can be placed upon these people is a consequence of the kinds of technologies that they're engaged in. And yes, you're totally right that there are that there have always been movement restrictions. But I think. And again, this is something which is not my area of expertise, but my sense is the movement restrictions that have been imposed upon parolees in the past have actually been sort of more gross movement. They've been more about, don't leave the area and beyond these kind of boundaries. What we're finding interesting is that, in fact, it's the gross movements that are safer for these guys, or more manageable and navigable to these guys than the moving across the city, getting myself from here to downtown Palo Alto without coming within a range of a school. So yeah, I think there have always been those kinds of restrictions, and what we're seeing is an intensification. What we're seeing is a transformation around a series of sort of technologies that allow for a different kind of monitoring. Yeah, the legal situation has been changing in the course of when we've been doing this study. We conducted, what is this now? This is late 2007. So we conducted our focus groups late 2005, early 2006, I think. The California Jessica's Law had just passed, it was on the books, but it passed in November. And yeah, so it might just have come into effect, but the technology isn't there to actually support it. So what there is a series of regulations, but there isn't necessarily, and there's a political will in some sense, but there isn't necessarily a technological foundation for doing it. And certainly even if technology were to be rolled out on a much more massive scale right now, nobody really quite knows how it works and what its problems are, particularly with respect to the kinds of things that Scott mentioned, for instance, about where GPS even works. These people were all participants in an early state trial and an early federal trial. They all got their units in early in various points, but sort of mainly around 2005. And I don't know to what extent, because we haven't been part of that discussion, to what extent the technology has been revised or what the technical conclusions were from those kinds of things, except perhaps the most obvious one being that the straps they were using on the state units were absolutely deeply inadequate, and these things were just breaking all the time. But I don't know yet what that's been.
Another interesting thing might be people who are being asked to have chips implanted for employment.
Yeah, actually, one of the things about it, the paper from this talk has things from the quotes from the focus group, and there are many of them that are quite compelling and disturbing. But one of the guys who actually wants to be chipped, I mean, he asks, cut my arm open and stick it in, right? Just don't stop messing around with this stuff. So yeah, those people would also be interesting. Again, different kinds of chips do different kinds of things with respect to infrastructures, and it's all about how you configure yourself with respect to an infrastructure. There was something else I was going to say. Oh yeah, I mean, the next criminal group who are in the sites for these kinds of technologies, at least in California, are gang members. But the kinds of restrictions you place on gang members are radically different from those that you would place on sex offenders, because there are problems of association. Right? And so if it's hard enough to navigate your point from point A to point B without coming within 200 feet of school, public park, library, and the rest of it, how much more complicated is it not to come within 2,000 feet of somebody else who's also wearing one of these units, who's also moving around? So I mean, I don't know what kind of conditions those will be, but they do become quite different. And so a lot of it is very much tied to not to technologies, conditions, and very particular kinds of situations. It's a real complicated mess. And of course, our people were also very conscious of the fact that they're largely situational offenders. They're not predatory offenders. These are not the kinds of technologies, the kinds of parole conditions that actually will apply to them. And so they're used to the fact that as sex offenders, they are a political football, to use at least a British phrase. Okay, thank you very much.
For information on other online Stanford seminars and courses, please visit study.stanford.edu.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.